Now we are moving on to the second session for the day, which is Green Nudges in Action. Mark, over to you.
A lot of what we're talking about today is how we support people making good decisions. And that's really what I do or try to do a lot in my work. So I work in the UK for an agricultural research consultancy called ADAS. My name is Mark Ramsden. I largely work in crop protection and integrated pest management. But I'm really interested in this idea of how we can help farmers and foresters making good decisions day to day. So what we wanted to do as part of the Green Nudges work was to kind of take an unapologetically naive approach and just go out and start talking to some projects to find out to what extent were nudges already being used. As Simone said, there's not a huge amount of literature out there on nudges already. And part of that is because some of the people who are implementing green nudges don't know that's what they are. They're doing good things. They're trying to help people make better choices. They don't know that that is under a framework of green nudges. So what we wanted to do was see if we could identify some examples of green nudges in existing projects over the last few years. To do that, the first thing we needed to understand was how we could disentangle what a green nudge was from other things that projects and initiatives might be doing. So we took the definition of green nudges that Nikos presented from our project, and we took out bits of that helped us to say whether something was or was not a green nudge. So first of all, we said, well, a green nudge is an intervention. So it's got to be an intervention, something that's intended to make a change. Because it's targeting decision making, it has to be against a specific decision. And as a green nudge, it's got to be something that's associated with transition towards more sustainable practices. And it cannot modify economic incentives, and it cannot reduce the decision maker's choice set. So we took that definition and we turned that into a framework that allowed us to talk to different projects and understand what it was they were doing and to what extent they were using or not using green nudges. So we went to them and we asked them, was this an intervention? Was it a specific targeting a decision? Was it related to sustainable practices? Does it have any modification of economic incentives? And was it restricting a choice set? And that essentially created this flowchart that we used to then go through and identify what people are doing, whether it was a green nudge or something else. So the first point was about the intervention. If it's something that's actively trying to bring about a change, that's an intervention. If that wasn't what they were trying to do, if there was no specific intention of a particular change, then this is dissemination and communication activities. And we went on through this. So was it about bringing a change in regulation? Because regulation restricts choice, it therefore can't be a green nudge. So we say these are regulatory intervention. If the target group is being paid or paying to be part of something, then it's a commercial intervention. If some of the alternative options were removed as part of being part of a group, then that's a community intervention. And if it's something that is trying to bring about a change, but it's not specific to a particular decision, so it's talking about a good way of doing things, but it's not saying this is a particular thing you should change, then we talk about a campaign intervention. If you kind of go through all that at the end, you define it as a green nudge. And then within green nudges, we have system 1, which are these automatic nudges, and system 2, which are the conscious nudges. And as Nico said, we are more interested in the conscious nudging approach of making people engage with a problem and change what they're doing based on that. So over the last year, we have been in touch with a range of different projects. Some of these are European funded projects, some of them are national projects, and we interviewed someone within those projects or initiatives to understand what they were doing and try and see where they were having interventions or not, and whether they classified as green nudges. Obviously today, I don't have time to go through all of those case studies. We will be writing them up and making them available over the coming months. But I'll just talk through some of the kind of headline results. I should say that process was done over a year, our approach changed a little bit as we went along, but it was all done through semi-structured interviews. So these were trying to capture a wide range of information. Part of that was to say whether we could identify green nudges or not, and part of it will feed into future work where we try and understand how effective, how efficient, and how ethical those approaches were, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So these are the different intervention types that we have identified in the case studies. We found one project really focused on communication and dissemination activities, and that was the Modern ACCIS project, which is completely unsurprising because what they're trying to do is increase uptake and engagement with ACCIS systems across Europe. There is no behavioural intervention really happening there. They're really trying to, it really is a focus on communication and dissemination. So there's not a surprise with that, but it's nice to see it come through in the process. 3 of the projects that we talked to, we have identified as campaign interventions. So they're trying to promote particular approaches, but they're not really targeting specific behavioural decisions. And so while there's a huge amount of excellent work going on there, they don't tick our criteria as green nudges. So it's worth saying at this point that our definition is useful as far as it is useful. But it doesn't mean that it truly categorizes everything. And what we found is that while we're trying to disentangle this, it is a much more complex picture, as you would expect. So some of these, yes, there's a campaign intervention. Yes, they were talking about good things to do. But as part of that, there might be an element of nudging going on as well, that kind of comes into that. So nothing is quite as black and white as perhaps might come across if I'm not careful. We did identify one commercial intervention, which is the Yield Enhancement Network, which was run by ADAS in the UK. And I find this one a really interesting one because within that network, there was an intention to improve decisions on farm around crop productivity. And so there was some really nice application of things like benchmarking. There was a competition element. There was a lot of peer-to-peer discussion. So a lot of the things that we would identify as potentially as nudging. However, because to be part of that network, you had to pay a fee to get in. And because the competition had a kind of sponsorship element and there was definite commercial engagement, that kind of dominates the whole thing as the starting point. So while they were using nudges within that, overall, it is commercial intervention. And that really, for me, highlights how there are these interactions going on that we haven't really got to the bottom of understanding yet. And also explains why a lot of the published research on nudging has really focused on some very clear-cut examples, largely informational nudging, because they're just more isolated and easier to write up. And that's where we are with the topic at the moment. But in over half of the projects and initiatives that we interviewed, we were finding green nudges. We were finding that people were doing these things. They were trying to address specific decisions. They were trying to understand the bias, and they were trying to make improve that decision-making process as part of the project. Although I don't think any of them had identified nudging as that process. The one I'll talk about, because I'm more familiar with it, is IPM decisions. This was a Horizon 2020 funded project that ran between 2019 and 2024. And in that project, it was developing an online platform for decision support systems for integrated pest management. So within that project, there was a very clear identification that it was an intervention, that we were trying to support better decisions around the risks associated with different pests, and we were trying to target particular decision-making processes. And it was intended to help farmers reduce reliance on pesticides, and specifically to reduce application of unnecessary pesticides where the risk wasn't high enough to justify that. So there was no regulatory change involved. There was no financial exchange. There were no restrictions on any decisions associated with it, and it was targeting specific decisions, and it was designed to support to sustainable, more sustainable practices. So it ticked all of our criteria as being a green nudge process. This is just a screenshot from the platform that was developed. And I won't go into lots of detail, but the first thing to say is, as you can see, we used the traffic light coloring in there. So this just shows we were using system 1 nudging as well in the platform, just to very quickly show people what their current risks were. But then once you get into the platform, you can start to dig in, and it'll have descriptions, it'll have identifications of when the risk is increasing for a particular given pest in a particular given crop. You can find more information about that. You can dig down into where this information has come from. So it's all supporting a more conscious decision-making process, and ultimately trying to reduce the ambiguity about a risk of a particular pest. So trying to address that ambiguity bias that we see in agriculture, particularly around pest management. So I don't want to go into lots and lots of detail today because we haven't got time. We will be writing these up and sharing them afterwards. What we haven't done yet, and what the next stage will be, is trying to understand, okay, we might know if it's a green nudge or not, but is it efficient? Is it effective? And how ethical is it? And so we're starting to develop that framework, and we have collected data from all of those case studies that will help us to address this. So we are still in the process of defining some of these terms. It kind of overlaps again with what Prudent will be doing. We'll try and cross over with them to align things. Just in the context of IPM decisions, my feeling is we will find that it's very effective, and we've got good evidence that shows that the use of decision support systems is very effective in helping farmers to make more informed choices and reduce their reliance on pesticides. Because it's so open and transparent, and because we developed the platform, I hope we will find that it is quite an ethical approach. I'm fairly confident of that. However, I suspect what we'll find is that the efficiency is not so good. And what we've seen, despite having pushed this for quite a few years, is the uptake of IPM decisions remains quite slow. And part of that is because of the amount of time investment needed, not just by us to promote it, but by the user to embed it into their processes is quite high. And the benefits of it take a little while to come back. So the efficiency of it is slightly lower. And that's something hopefully we'll be able to tease out in our framework as we go forward. We've already heard quite a few mentions of the need for co-design of these kind of systems, and I'm sure that's something that's going to come up again through today. Again, just on the example of IPM decisions, we started right at the beginning of that project with co-design. So we had workshops across Europe trying to engage farmers and advisors in the process of what a decision support system platform should look like, how it should be embedded in their decision making. So we really wanted to get that co-design with the target group from the start, and we've been able to follow that and track that through. Even with that co-design, it was still a challenge to get the right balance, but I think that's something we can certainly move more on and hopefully discuss during the hackathon later on today. One thing that's become really clear from the case studies and from the other work we're doing is that green nudges in isolation really are going to be limited in how much effect they can have. So you need to have all of these things going on in parallel. You need communication, dissemination, you need regulatory change as well. You need commercial engagement, you need communities, as well as green nudges. All of these things working together to actually achieve transition towards more sustainable practices. And all of these things need to be assessed on how we can match up how effective and efficient and ethical particular interventions are in a particular scenario to make them work in the long term. And all of that is going to require co-design. And so it's trying to fit all these things together. We've still got quite a long way to go to really start to tease out which particular approaches are more effective for particular bias and particular situations. But I think it kind of, what we're doing pairs nicely with what we see in the Prudent project, that we understand there is a need for this framework, and we're starting to piece these bits of the puzzles together. We've created a library for GreenNudge resources, which is open for anyone to have a look at. We are starting to put different things in there. So the literature review that we've done is in there. There's a bit of information about the projects. There's a video about green nudges. It is also an open resource. So anyone can look at any of these resources, but also if you've got things that you want to share, you can add these into our library as well. There is a function that says add resource. You complete the form, submit that, we'll check it doesn't say anything rude, and if we're happy, we'll put it in. So if you have got examples of nudges, if you've got reports or things you want to share, please do use this. This will later on evolve into a bigger iNudge academy filled with lots of resources and training and examples as our projects progress. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Erwin Wouters. I'm an agriculture economist. I work here in Belgium at the social science unit of the Flanders Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. I added one sentence to the title, which is in your program. I'm a member of the Prudent Research Consortium, and there we have a specific work package where we want to investigate the situation when firms nudge other firms, or more specifically, when farmers and foresters are being nudged by companies with whom they are doing business with or with whom they could do business with, so with companies in the supply chains that they are active. The work package is still very much ongoing, so today I will just introduce the topic to you. And yeah, hopefully at next year's conference I might be able to present some more insights. There have been many definitions on nudging already provided, so I can actually be quite fast. Nudge, a gentle push, encourages people, does not restrict freedom of choice. I just want to highlight here that the use of behavioral insights in public policy, but also in supply chain governance, it involves potentially more than just nudges. It also depends on when you call something a nudge or it's an intervention, and how broad or narrow your definition of nudges are. Green nudging then, that has also already been provided definitions for. Also here I want to highlight something additional. I think implicitly, it's not explicitly said, but implicitly it's seen as some kind of neutral non-business actor, like a policymaker, an NGO, a civil society organization, implementing nudges to steer people's behavior towards the greater good, societal well-being, societal welfare. But we have seen that, in fact, beyond policymakers and other organizations, also firms nudge each other. Also firms use behavioral insights in how they manage their interactions with other firms. And Prudent intends to investigate these practices first by identifying them, analyzing the impact, and provide recommendations so that their impact is indeed for the greater good, and that also we have societal welfare created by these nudges. An agri-food supply chain, food and forestry supply chains, I apologize because some of my figures and sometimes even wording is steered towards farming, because that's the sector I work in. But the same principles hold for forestry supply chains as well. So this is a very stylized picture of a agri-food supply chain. Along this supply chain, there are flows of information, flows of products and services, flows of money, flows of influence as well. This is a stylized picture. Not every agri-food supply chain looks like that. So-called short food supply chain, for instance, they would have much less actors on the right-hand side of farmers, and so less intermediaries between the farmer and the consumer. Yeah, some are local, which means that the physical distance between all these actors is quite small. Some can be described as global, where the physical distance could be like the entire world. And something in between. Some are very fragmented, whereas others are heavily coordinated across different segments of the supply chain. In some sectors, companies rather manage their individual interactions, business interactions and practices on their own on an individual basis. Some other sectors are heavily vertically integrated, where one or a few companies try to manage the entire, or let's say a very big part of the supply chain, both downstream and upstream. from the segment in which they are themselves. Some of these supply chain management practices are quite informal, sometimes resting on verbal agreement. Some are also very formal by using contracts, for instance. And we know supply chain governance, regardless of how the supply chain looks like, so whether it's local, global, there is supply chain management at place. It refers to the rules, the coordination mechanisms, the power relationships. So anything which actors put in place or have put in place that manages the interactions they have, the flow of information, flow of products, services, the flow of money. And that goes along the supply chain. Some of that supply chain governance is also public, when, for instance, governments implement, monitor and enforce food safety standards, for instance, or animal welfare standards or environmental standards. But a lot of supply chain governance also happens by private companies. Why do they do that? That's a long list, not necessarily intended for you to read. But if private companies implement certain supply chain governance principles, practices, mechanisms, the main motivation is usually to improve their profitability and also to improve their long-term profitability and hence long-term survival. As an economist, I say that without any value judgment about that, but that's what it is. And then there are a lot of sub-motivations, sub-dimensions to that, which eventually is meant to safeguard their long-term survival of their business and company. How do they do that? Again, here is a stylized picture. They implement standards to each other, quality standards. They implement rules, certain things that need to be complied with before farmers, for instance, can deliver to a processor. They might implement price premiums for certain quality or certain sustainability criteria beyond a certain threshold. Other price incentives, they could be negative price incentives as well, price penalties when quality does not meet certain criteria. Information as well, certain information, advice, companies give each other advice on what practices to implement to improve the sustainability or profitability. Input suppliers, for instance, give advice to farmers on how to use the products they sell to farmers. And we see that on top of all these more formal mechanisms, standards, price mechanisms, we see that more and more companies also use behavioral insights to manage the supply chain, to manage their interactions with other companies. So behavioral supply chain governance, it refers to the use of those behavioral insights, again, to manage the interactions and the business interactions along a supply chain. It uses social norms, nudges, trust, feedback, and all other kind of things on top of that. Why do they do that? Why do they add, and this is my hypothesis, it's not yet a result, but what is their motivation? I think partially it can be a necessity because they see that their formal procedures are not working very well. Some of these rules, monitoring and enforcement practices, they are also quite costly to implement. People don't always react or behave rationally, so certain price incentives might not necessarily lead to the results you would expect from neoclassical economics point of view. Complex issue requires some additional supply chain governance practices. And then, of course, also the opportunity. I think they have learned a lot on how behavioral insights can also be used to influence the behavior of companies, of people that other companies interact with. So it's also seen as an opportunity to further improve the outcome of their supply chain management. We have done some literature search, but also internet. For full disclosure, I have been helped by AI tools to do this, although it's not yet a systematic scraping of the internet or whatever. But these are 8 categories of things that we know are in place. You will recognize a lot of them. They are actually often comparable to the categories that Simone, for instance, has already. Where are you? I don't see you anymore. That Simone has already presented. So we see things like default pre-selection, where in digital tech platforms, There are already pre-filled recommendations for climate smart practices. We see that upstream companies, input suppliers, offer default seeds or default fertilizer bundles, thereby using the opt-out versus opt-in mechanism of farmers. A second is framing or reframing, messaging, reframing sustainability as risk management, reframing the application of integrated pest management as something that a good farmer would do, appealing to producer identity. So basically reframing the information that they are usually already giving, using behavioral insights so that the information would be more effective. This we have also seen social norms, peer comparisons. It can take the form of balanced scorecards, benchmarking systems where, for instance, a processor keeps that in an anonymized way of all their farmers that are supplying to them, and then farmers can see if they're laggards, that they would be stimulated through social comparison mechanisms to catch up. Third, salience and attention, label-ready tracking tools or app notifications. If input providers, they provide also apps, digital tech apps to help decision-making. That built in within these apps, you would get, for instance, seasonal reminders when it's a good time to do a certain practice on your farm, plant cover crops in this example. So like using salience and attention reminders type of nudges or behavioral features. Simplification, decision aids, removing sludge, one-click compliance tools, or infographics, visual summaries rather than huge parts or big pieces of text, again, when they provide information to farmers or foresters. Commitment, public recognition, recognition programs, buyers, processors, cooperative, they publish a list of sustainability champions, for instance, or retailers encourage farmers to sign voluntary codes of conduct where they pledge to produce more sustainably or produce more animal welfare friendly, for instance. That's also reframing, incentive framing, loss aversion framing, productivity linked narratives. For instance, how reduced fertilizer use, rotational grazing, certain practices can actually improve yields over time, perhaps not immediately, but maybe over time. So appealing to producer logic rather than just counting on their moral obligation to implement more sustainable practices. And then number 8, last category is these bundled nudges within services, whereby, for instance, input suppliers, when they provide seeds or fertilizers, they immediately provide also free advice embedded in the input package that farmers buy. So these are a number of things. I don't know, Mark, if literally every one of those is a nudge according to some of the definitions you have used. But I do think that many of these use the same behavioral insights that nudges are using, and companies. Well, I believe companies have more and more an idea of what is working and what is not working. Also using big data from their clients, from their providers, etc. Perhaps they don't always know the deep psychological processes that are taking place, but I think they know quite well and better what is working and what is not working in stimulating the behavior of companies they interact with. Why are we investigating this? Because we believe that this practice may have some areas for policy concern. There has been already, also by Arnaud, for instance, mentions made about the ethical aspects of nudging. And we believe that if it's companies nudging other companies, companies nudging farmers, some of these ethical aspects might even become more prominent, more important to investigate. But first, also the effectiveness, cost effectiveness. Research shows, for instance, that the source of the nudger, can also affect the impact, the effectiveness of a nudge. And then the question would be, do farmers have more trust in the government versus the companies they interact with? I have already seen research, for instance, also within supply chain, that farmers have way more trust in the people upstream from them, their input supplier, compared to people downstream from them. It's also there. Effectiveness, not just on does the nudge reach its intended goal, but also what are the other impacts. We know, or it is my conviction, that private governance is usually done, including private governance with behavioral insights, it's done from an individual profitability point of view. I think that it's the role of policymakers to create conditions so that these actions can also serve the societal good, the greater good, and don't create too many inequities or negative side effects. Then, of course, ethical equity concerns. It raises questions about autonomy, consent, manipulation, also a word which has already been used here today. Power asymmetries in supply chains may actually constrict freedom of choice, even if the nudge or the practice that's been implemented is in fact voluntary, but if it's implemented by a huge company that has like 60% market share, then the border between something voluntary and something mandatory might get blurred. Also equity, I think Simone, you referred to segmentation. I think also companies know very well how to segment their providers, their clients. If we do that, that of course raises also questions regarding the equity consequences of doing this differential nudging of companies towards farmers or foresters, for instance. What about small farmers and other types of farmers that may react differently to being nudged? Some institutional governance views. There is concern also about that these soft steering substitutes for hard regulation. Indeed, we know many people don't like hard regulation, but then the question is whether these more soft steering approaches have the same impact than hard regulation. You could go from a public governance system where the government intervenes quite a lot to a more private governance system of these supply chains, of sustainability in supply chains. Not necessarily a bad thing, but again, it raises questions on what the outcome is and what the speed is with which sustainability transformations take place. So some possible areas for policy intervention. One relates to transparency disclosure. Should policymakers require firms to disclose the behavioral nudges they are using in a business-to-business setting? Should they create standards for nudging ethics in corporate sustainability reporting, for instance? A second aspect or possible area for policy intervention is about capacity building for producers, for instance, support programs to educate smallholders and suppliers about behavioral tools that are being put in place. Enable counter nudges to safeguard producer autonomy, like opt-out prompts, clear trade-offs. In literature, the word budge has been invented for this, where policymakers implement something to prevent people from being nudged or from the negative impacts, possible negative impacts of being nudged. Standardizing choice architecture tools. Should there be guidelines for the ethical design of sustainability tools, apps, decision aids? Perhaps public agencies or NGOs could certify choice tools based on behavioral neutrality or fairness. And then incentivizing transparent innovation, procedural legitimacy, co-creation has already been mentioned by Arnaud, by you, Mark. Perhaps offer public support for firms developing open source nudging, encourage co-design nudges where producers or the people are being nudged participate in the design of the nudges and other tools. So to conclude, just like public policy is increasingly becoming a behavioral public policy where behavioral insights are used to improve the policy outcomes, also supply chain governance is increasingly a behavioral supply chain governance where also their behavioral insights are being used. It's not recent. Indeed, a nudge is a name for something that probably exists much longer, but has never been called a nudge. Also, all the examples I had, the majority of them were not actively called a nudge. So it's not a recent phenomenon. I do think that scale has been increasing, and also do think that the evidence that companies can use, for instance, using big data, that the evidence that they have to implement these nudges is widely increasing. I think there is scientific interest, but still rather limited. And I think it's important because when firms nudge other firms, especially in supply chains with big power inequalities, it raises additional questions, even beyond ethical legitimacy questions of when policymakers are nudging farmers or foresters. So that's it for my introduction. And I hope to have a further nice discussion, for instance, in Group 4, where we're going to discuss the ethical aspects of nudging.